Our second panel kind of touches on a bit what we mentioned before, in kind of figuring out where conservatism needs to go, especially on a college campus. Social issues are divisive as any. So figuring out whether or not to borrow a phrase from Mitch Daniels to draw a truce on social issues is the topic of our second panel. And our moderator, William F.B. O'Reilly, no relation, is a New York-based political and corporate communication strategist and twice-weekly columnist for Newsday. He also serves on the board of directors for this very Buckley program. So we're running a little bit behind, so I'm going to keep the introduction short and introduce our moderator to get the second panel going.
I realize I'm taller and thinner on the no-spin zone. So, anyway, I have the very simple task today of taking this knock-kneed little lamb and throwing it into the arena. And we have some extremely able people on the panel today to address the topic. I hope through their remarks, if you could all think of what questions you might like to ask, because the microphones are open, and probably after I'll start with a question. And after their introductory remarks, I would love to have people come up and ask questions. Again, the microphones are here. And if you can remember to end your question with a question mark, would be terrific. I have bios for these three gentlemen, and none of them need introductions. But they're extensive bios, so I decided to read 4 inches of each. And so it may stop at a semicolon. It may stop at a the. Just forgive me for that. I'm going to go 4 inches. So I'm going to start with Roger Kimball, because Manhattan Institute is near and dear to my heart as a New Yorker, and I've watched Manhattan Institute's policies save my city, so I will begin there. Roger Kimball is editor and publisher of The New Criterion and president and publisher of Encounter Books. He is an art critic for National Review and writes a regular column for PJ Media at Rogers Rules. Mr. Kimball lectures widely and has appeared on national radio and television programs as well as the BBC. Mr. Kimball's latest book, The Fortunes of Permanence, is Culture and Anarchy in the Age of Amnesia. He is also author of The Rape of Masters, Lives of the Mind, The Use and Abuse of Intelligence from Hegel to Woodhouse, An Art's Prospect, The Challenge of Tradition in an Age of Celebrity. Other titles by Mr. Kimball include The Long March, How the Cultural Revolution of the 1960s Changed America, and Experiments Against Reality, The Fate of Culture in Postmodern Age. Mr. Kimball is also the author of Tenured Radicals, How Politics Has Corrupted Our Higher Education. A new edition of Tenured Radicals, Revised and Expanded, was published by Ivan R.D. in 2008. Ryan T. Anderson researches and writes about marriage and religious liberty at the William E. Simon Fellow, as the William E. Simon Fellow in Religion and Free Society at the Heritage Foundation. He also focuses on justice and moral principles in economic thought, healthcare and education, and his expertise in bioethics and natural law theory. Anderson, who joined Heritage's DeVoe Center for Religion and Civil Society in 2012, also is the editor of Public Discourse, the online journal of the Witherspoon Institute of Princeton, New Jersey. Anderson's recent work focuses on the moral and constitutional questions surrounding the same-sex marriage issue. He is the co-author with Princeton's Robert P. George and Sheriff Gurgis of What is Marriage, Man and Women, a Defense. The three also co-wrote the article, What is Marriage, in the winter 2011 issue of Harvard Journal of Law and Public Policy. And finally, Bret Stephens is the deputy editorial page editor responsible for international opinion pages of the Wall Street Journal. He also writes Global View, the paper's weekly foreign affairs column, and is a member of the journal's editorial board. He is a regular panelist on the journal Editorial Report, a weekly political talk show broadcast on the Fox News Channel. Mr. Stephens joined the journal in 1998 as an op-ed editor and moved to Brussels the following year, where he wrote editorials and edited a column on the European Union. He left Dow Jones in January 2002 to become editor-in-chief of the Jerusalem Post, a position he assumed at age 28. At the Post, he was responsible for the paper's news editorial international electronic editions. He oversaw the paper's most extensive redesign in its then 70-year history and also wrote a weekly column. So, taking the little lamb by the legs, I will toss it into the ring. One interesting study that was written about in the Atlantic recently talked about the millennial generation and how the millennials are developing a deep distrust, more than a distrust really, a disconnection with government. They don't look to government or see government as the place for answers. They don't seek solutions from the government, so someone is doing something right. But on the social issues, gay marriage in particular, the millennials are veering sharply from the conservative side. And so with that, I'll throw the question out there, and if we could begin with Roger.
Thank you, Bill. Well, I've always sort of found it irritating when a student or a panelist begins by saying, I want to rethink the question. I don't really like the question. But, I wish that they would begin with a forthright, and if I may so put it, a sort of Anglo-Saxon frankness, and just, try to answer the blasted thing. But I am going to do that today. I'm going to begin by questioning this question a bit. Should conservatives accept a truce on social issues? Now, I promise I will eventually get around, if not to answering the question, at least to responding to it. But I want to begin by making a few observations about it. As was mentioned by Nat, I think, and as this handsome and well-educated audience would know, in any event, the question is an allusion to something that Mitch Daniels said, and I want to say that there's no contemporary politician who I hold in higher esteem than Mitch Daniels. He said back in 2010 that perhaps the next president would have to call a truce on the so-called social issues. Why? Because, Mitch said, there was a new red menace, the red menace of incontinent federal spending and paralyzing levels of debt that constituted a sort of national emergency that took priority over everything else. Now, Mitch Daniels was pretty seriously upbraided by some conservatives for that remark, just as he was applauded by some libertarians and other fiscal conservatives who are nervous about how well moral issues play at the polls. Now, I'm not sure, frankly, to be frank, whether either side really did justice to what Mitch was getting at. Since making that remark in an interview, he's returned to the subject a few times and has tried to put a sort of spin on it, perhaps add a little nuance. At CPAC not so long ago, for example, he said, "It is up to us," meaning us conservatives, "it's up to us to show the best way back to greatness and to argue for it with all the passion of our patriotism. But should the best way be blocked while the enemy draws nearer, then someone will need to find the second best way, or the third, because the nation's survival requires it. Purity and martyrdom," Mitch said, "is for suicide bombers. King Pyrrhus is remembered, but his nation disappeared. Winston Churchill set aside his lifelong loathing of communism in order to fight World War II." Now that strikes me as wise counsel, about which I discern the spirit of prudence, not capitulation. Fiat justitia et pereat mundus. Let there be justice though the world perish. That is not, I think, a motto any real conservative would willingly embrace. After all, you're not much of a conservative if at the end of the day you have nothing with you that you have conserved. Now that said, I think we want to be cautious about that truce that Mitch Daniels evoked, the way in which it's been understood. One way of getting at that understanding is to look at how it has been assimilated to the so-called Buckley doctrine or Buckley rule, the idea, in its demotic transcription, that we conservatives ought to rally around the most conservative candidate who is electable. Those two things together. Now that's how the Buckley doctrine has been disseminated in its post-Buckley reincarnation. You've all heard it. My friend Karl Rove wheeled it out early and often in the last election. But as our own Neil Freeman, who's here somewhere in the audience, he was there at the creation, so to speak, and he has demonstrated, I think, beyond cavil in a column about this, that the Buckley doctrine, as originally formulated, was something quite different. The year was 1964. The choice was between Nelson Rockefeller, the Republican establishment's darling, and Barry Goldwater, the impossible firebrand. Whom should National Review endorse? The debate raged for some time in the sancta sanctorum of NR's editorial offices, some editors arguing one side, others arguing the other side. In the fullness of time, the dictum came down from WFB himself. National Review would support, quote, the rightward most viable candidate, i.e., Barry Goldwater, unelectable in 1964, but viable in the sense of representing a robust and coherent conservative vision of the world. It was the same in 1965 at the New York mayoral race. Bill Buckley hadn't a chance of winning. Indeed, when asked what he would do if he were to win, famously replied, demand a recount. But Bill's candidacy was viable because it enabled him to put before the public an articulate case for various important conservative ideas. The point is that powerful ideas can have powerful consequences. Barry Goldwater didn't stand a chance of winning in 1964, but his candidacy was part of the galvanizing force that ushered in Ronald Reagan into the White House some 15 years later. Bill's mayoral race didn't see him into Gracie Mansion, but it was one of the propedeutic elements that helped see his brother Jim into the Senate a few years later. I think Neil Freeman got to the core distinction when he observed that, quote, we all understand that it is Karl Rove's mission to promote the Republican Party. It was the mission of Bill Buckley to promote the conservative cause. There should be no confusion between the two. But of course, there's been lots of confusion between the two, which brings me back to this panel's guiding question. Should conservatives accept a truce on social issues? Now, perhaps I missed the memo, but has any such truce been offered to conservatives? I doubt it. Nor is this surprising. Democrats long ago discovered that what Mitch Daniels euphemistically referred to as social issues were really effective sticks with which to beat Republicans, both conservatives and the other sort. If you glean your news from such purveyors of establishment sentiment as the New York Times and MSNBC, or the news offices of our major universities, you might think that Republican politicians were obsessed with those social issues. I think a good case could be made that many are terrified of that suite of issues. It is the left-wingers who keep them front and center. They're ever ready to wheel them out for an impromptu litmus test to prove that the candidate in question is insufficiently blue, which is to say, insufficiently base, ambiguity over the word base, intentional. Now, Aristotle, following Jonah Goldberg, defined rhetoric as the art of persuasion. And I, too, want to talk about persuasion a little bit. It is the political art par excellence, because the metabolism of politics ordinarily operates through persuasion, not through demonstration and not through force. I submit that conservatives, through a combination of bumbling ineptness and historical accident, have unwittingly ceded the rhetorical high ground to the left. Unfolding the reasons for this would take us into deep waters and well into the next panel's time and beyond. For now, reverting once again to the title of this panel, I'd like to suggest that if conservatives are going to be successful in standing athwart history, they need to be sure that they are standing on solid ground. Conservatives do not win elections by pretending to be leftists. And by the way, I'd like to note, when I say pretending to be leftists, not pretending to be liberals, because it is one of the signal rhetorical achievements of the left that it has managed to appropriate the term liberal for an ideology which is so conspicuously illiberal and antipathetic to freedom. It's a very interesting rhetorical feat that they have accomplished. But conservatives have repeatedly pretended to be leftists, or at least non-conservative. You see this partly in their disingenuous tergiversation over those social issues. More centrally, however, you see it in their abandonment of the enabling resources that have traditionally rendered the conservative vision of the world compelling. The leftist establishment, having been to school with John Stuart Mill, has taught that terms like custom, convention, habit, and so on, are the outmoded relics of a superstitious and insufficiently rational age. Many contemporary conservatives have lacked the gumption, not to say the intelligence and rhetorical wit, to dispute this claim and show that, on the contrary, such terms name indispensable moral resources. As National Review's late, great James Burnham observed, most people are not existentially moved by statistics or a number attached to Social Security payments or the national debt. They are moved by a vision of the world. That is what conservatives have to sell, a way of living our lives. Though many, in their eagerness to join the establishment consensus, seem to have forgotten that fact. Let me conclude by asking, where are we standing when we stand athwart history? In Bill Buckley's famous publisher's statement introducing the inaugural issue of National Review, he noted that the new magazine would be out of place in the sense that the United Nations and the League of Women Voters and the New York Times and Henry Steele Commanger are in place. It is out of place, said Bill, because in its maturity, literate America rejected conservatism in favor of radical social experimentation. The brash new magazine had arrived with its brash young editor to cast a cold and inquisitive light upon that presumption. National Review stands athwart history, Bill announced, yelling stop at a time when no one is inclined to do so or to have much patience with those who so urge it. Now, Bill wrote that more than 50 years ago, but I suspect that you will find, as I did on rereading it, that it has preternaturally contemporary relevance. Radical social experimentation, the inroads that relativism have made on the American soul, the intransigence of the liberals who run this country. If those yelling stop in 1955 were out of place, how much more are they now out of place in 2013, when what Bill called the relationship of the state to the individual in America may be undergoing its most thoroughgoing transformation in history? Am I overstating things? Think about it. Just before the 2008 election, Barack Obama declared to his acolytes that he was only a few days away from, quote, fundamentally transforming the United States of America. If you didn't believe him then, if you thought that talk of fundamentally transforming the country was mere hustings hyperbole, perhaps the last 5 years will have convinced you otherwise. Ideas, Bill observed in that editorial, rule the world. What ideas? Well, liberty, for one. The United States was conceived in liberty, as Lincoln put it. The idea of individual freedom was the country's cynosure, its guiding principle. By 1955, that principle had been insidiously undermined by well-intentioned dispensations of literate America, intoxicated as it was by radical social experimentation. Think of it. In 1955, Bill Buckley argued that there never was an age of conformity quite like this one. And today, looking back, we understand that the dampening spirit of conformity and the assault on freedom were then in its infancy. They have suddenly come of age. The question is not whether Bill's inaugural bulletin is still pertinent. It could hardly be more so. The question is whether those uncorroded by a cynical contempt for human freedom will command the wit, rhetoric, and moral courage to stand athwart tomorrow, whispering, confiding, explaining, sometimes even yelling, "Stop," in order that freedom might have an opportunity to prevail. We have our work cut out for us. Thank you.
We're going to move from left to right in the opening statements, and in that I mean stage left to right, so no inferences. So Bret, why don't you go ahead?
Well, thank you for hosting me here at this wonderful event. So many illustrious people in the audience, as well as to my left and right, all senses. A story is told that I'm sure it's true, that a backpacker about 30 years ago was traveling through Greece and comes to the top of a hill that overlooks a pretty fishing village in the distance. And he notices, sitting silently just to his side, a very old man with a big white beard, contemplating the scene. Backpacker takes off his pack, takes out his canteen, takes a swig of water, passes it or offers it to the old man. The old man takes the canteen, takes a swig. There's some silence. Finally, the old man says, "Stranger, behold yonder village. Do you notice the pretty boats in the harbor, all at their moorings? I built all of those boats. Do they call me Mikas, the shipwright? They do not." Long silence, and finally the old man looks at the backpacker again and says, "And stranger, notice that high stone wall around the village to keep out the thieves and the brigands and the barbarians. Do they call me Mikas the wall builder? They do not." More silence. And he says, "And furthermore, stranger, observe the pretty tiles, the red tiles on those whitewashed houses. I tiled every one of those homes. Do they call me Mikas the roofer? They do not. I sleep with one sheep." The conservative movement today, I would offer, is Mikas the shipwright. It is the movement that in the 1930s and 1940s and 1950s understood that the trend of history was not leading inexorably towards the totalitarian or technocratic state, and stood athwart it rightly and was vindicated by that. It understood in the 50s and 60s, and then with a brief hiatus in the 70s and the 80s certainly, what a peril the USSR represented to Western civilization and to American interests, and how dangerous also it was to try to appease the Soviets or try to reach a kind of détente with them. And at least that wing of the Republican Party did the right thing, and they were vindicated as well. A lot of conservatives, and I think few more so than Roger here, have stood athwart the trends in academia leading toward multiculturalism, cultural relativism, moral relativism, the assault on what, at least when I went to college, was known as the DWIMs, the dead white European males. They have been vindicated, at least morally, if not in actual fact. And they have been the ones who have been standing up against Obamacare and Dodd-Frank and all the rest of that. But there's that sheep. And the sheep, in my view, is what we call, and I know imperfectly or inaccurately or unfortunately, the social issues. And here, there is a problem for the Republican Party, which is, after all, the vehicle, like it or not, of the conservative movement. But also for conservatism itself, there is a political problem and there's a principles problem. The political problem, I think, is well noted in a lot of polling data, which suggests that certainly among people Ryan's age, I'm a few years older than he is, the trend is moving very much in the opposite direction, in that issues like particularly marriage equality are becoming dispositive, fundamental in terms of the political outlook of a whole generation of people. And the evidence, just anecdotally, but I think, again, there's a good deal of polling evidence to this as well, suggests that if this party continues to be the party that basically is seen as the anti-gay party or the anti-marriage equality party, we will continue to suffer for it and suffer for it with every passing electoral cycle. And it will be one of those issues where you will meet people in your everyday life who say, well, I agree with the Republicans about Obamacare and I can't stand Dodd-Frank, but you know something? They're a party of haters. And this is a political reality that we have to deal with. That being said, that wouldn't be a bad thing, okay? It's not always a bad thing to take a politically unpopular stance. It's not always a bad thing to suffer for it politically if you're standing for a principle that validates a larger set of principles or a deeper set of principles. But I think in a number of respects, that's precisely what we're not doing, and I think that's unfortunate and even tragic. What I mean by this is I think there's a kind of misunderstanding of what American conservatism is about or ought to be about. And there's a misunderstanding of how the Republicans ought to be going about for it. The Republican Party is the Freedom Party. It has always been the Freedom Party. It began as the Freedom Party in 1856 or 4 or something like that. And it continues in many ways in life to be the party that is against the nanny state, statist intervention in your personal lives, in your economic choices, in your cultural choices, and every other kind of choice that you can make. Except for some reason, we've decided to take a very contrary view when it comes to these social issues, gay issues and abortion issues in particular. Second of all, the great insight of American conservatism, and this goes back to Madison and the founding and the whole debate between the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists. By the way, the Library of America puts out this wonderful 2-volume set, Federalists and Anti-Federalists, and it's worth reading the whole thing because you don't really understand the Constitution until you understand what Thomas Paine and the Anti-Federalists were talking about. They were the Republic of virtue. They were the Republic of Minutemen, as one Federalist, not Madison or Hamilton or Jay. They were the Republic of Sparta. Spartan black broth is the phrase in there. Okay? And the founders take a very radically different view, and you see it in Federalist 10 and various other of the Federalist papers, that the genius of the American system is to channel the passions. Passions cannot be repressed, but they can be channeled to socially productive ends. You know, when Gordon Gekko in his way says greed is good, well, okay, you know, this is maybe not the most artful way of saying it, but in a sense, what capitalism is about is turning this passion for greed into a great, incredible, extraordinary social good. It transforms the passions. And this is what we should be doing wherever we find an opportunity to do it. However, we're not doing it when it comes to these social issues, particularly the gay issue and I think also the abortion issue. And I think this is costing us in terms of the consistency of our principles and also in terms of having a sound American political philosophy. I'm not talking about a religious political philosophy, a Catholic political philosophy or anything, although I do note, you know, Pope Francis has apparently called a truce on the social issues, but that's another story. But gay marriage is a perfect example of that. You know, a few years ago, there was a senator from Idaho who was caught in a bathroom tapping his foot. And his defense was, I have a wide stance. I mean, this should make people think. What is this senator doing with a wide stance? Well, we all know what he's doing, right? And it's disgusting and horrifying. But what's really disgusting and horrifying is he feels he has to basically go to the men's bathrooms to gratify himself. So what we ought to be for is finding a way of creating institutions which channel passions towards socially productive ends. I happen to live in what the rest of America likes to think of as not America, but actually is more America than anywhere else, which is the island of Manhattan. And one of the nice things about living on the island of Manhattan is you actually encounter this incredible institution called gay marriage, and you see gay couples, women, men, actually leading these productive, responsible lives. In my case, this is sheer anecdote, and I know anecdote is not data, okay, I get it. But in my case, my 4-year-old's best friend is being raised by 2 fathers. I think that's being raised better than being raised by 1 father or 1 mother, especially if they're a loving, committed couple who are raising a beautiful little child. And it should matter to us, by the way, what we're prepared to say to other people in their face. I know Ryan is going to make a very different case for mine, and by the way, I applaud him for it because in this day and age, it takes guts to take the position that he's about to take against me. I'm taking the easy position. I'm happy to acknowledge that. I just happen to believe this, but it takes guts, by the way, to say things to people's face, like go to a gay couple who have a child and say, you should not be raising your child. Say it. Would you say it? I bet there's not one person in this room who would say that. You think maybe it's socially uncouth or something, but you wouldn't say it because you know that there's something kind of awful about that. So that's something we should think about. One other point that I want to make, which is I had a debate with Michael Walzer at the Tikva Foundation a few months ago. And this is sort of apropos of nothing, but we were debating the morality of war, and he said Harry Truman is a war criminal for bombing Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And I said, well, if that's the case, then Harry Truman should have been brought up in a kind of Nuremberg tribunal. Wouldn't you support that? And he said, well, no, I think Harry Truman should have been punished by the electorate. I said, so to elect Tom Dewey as president, I mean, maybe that would have been a good idea, but that's the conclusion. The point I'm making is Walzer was absolutely uncomfortable with coming to terms with the logical conclusion of the statement he was making. And I would add here, just briefly touching on abortion, okay, about 50 million women in America have had abortions, give or take. Are people who are profoundly opposed to abortion for entirely legitimate reasons, are those people really prepared to say there are 50 million women who are murderers in this country? Look, if you're prepared to say it, I applaud the consistency of your principle, but I just throw that out for people in this audience to think about it, because I think very few people would really be prepared to say that woman and that woman and that woman, they're murderers. They're murderers among us. So we should be thinking about these sorts of issues. Again, I just want to conclude by saying, ultimately, this should not be about politics, okay? We should not simply take stands for the purposes of political convenience. And one of the things that I'm uncomfortable with the framing of this question, to go back to Roger, is this idea of a truce, okay? Truces you always lose, precisely not least because the other side certainly hasn't declared a truce. They're waging their own battle every single day. But a truce basically says, let's put this on the mute button, because we sort of believe these things, but we don't quite have the political courage of our convictions to say these things. I think that's a bad idea. We should always have the courage to say exactly what we believe, and we should be able to say things both privately and publicly with the same sense of honor and conviction and articulateness, which I'm not displaying. But these are the things that we should be doing. So I think that we don't need a truce on social issues. We need to start fundamentally aligning what our convictions are when they come to the economy, when they come to our foreign policy, when they come to the things that we say about, say, the way the Iranians run their regime, or the Palestinians run their authority, and so on. We have to align that with the things that we believe here in the United States are best for the maximization of liberty. I happen, in my cheating sense, to look over at Ryan, and I notice he has a quote from the Declaration of Independence, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And I bet he's going to talk about life. Great. Let's not forget this wonderful pregnant phrase which distinguishes America from every other country in the world and which makes us a magnet to people from all over the world. The pursuit of happiness. That is what conservatives, that is what Republicans should be for, that is what Democrats, that is what Mike Bloomberg have all spent their lives opposed to. We should be the party for the pursuit of happiness. Thank you.
I just want to make one thing clear before Ryan speaks. I never, never, never would have thrown the lamb in the ring had I known that Nikos was waiting for him.
So it's tempting to go off the outline that I have here and just respond to some of what Bret just said. But I'm going to refrain from doing that. I'll wait to the Q&A and the discussion portion. But I'll just say three short things. I think there's a lack of nuance if you think the abortion issue is either every woman who's ever had an abortion is a murderer or you shouldn't be pro-life. I think if you see it as that dichotomy, there's a lack of nuance in your thinking here. Not every killing is an instance of a murder, and not everyone who has killed someone is a murderer. Likewise, I don't think you would think that the definition of marriage would therefore hinge that same-sex couples are bad parents or should never be raising children, or that it therefore would be better to be raised by a single mother or a single father. Again, I think that's a lack of nuance in your thinking about what marriage is and why it matters, if you think that those are the alternatives and that that's the dichotomy in which you should phrase the issue. And then lastly, if you believe what the New York Times reports about the Catholic Church and Pope Francis, why? They don't report accurately on anything else. So why would you take your knowledge about what the Pope's thinking from the New York Times? Or for the Wall Street Journal, for that matter. I think some of the thinking here shows a certain Georgetown cocktail party and or Manhattan Island editorial boardroom thinking about American life. And Bret passed me a note beforehand saying, let's mix it up. So I'm only responding to the note. But now I'll get to the points that I wanted to make in the 10 minutes that I have this afternoon. I want to talk about three things, make three basic points about this issue about truce. First is about principles. Second will be about practicalities. And then third will be about politics. So I'll start with principles. Supporting the so-called social issues is the right thing to do. It's the principled thing to do. The conservative movement exists to conserve the truths of the Declaration of Independence. The conservative movement exists to conserve the strength of civil society. Just as the conservative movement is right to defend free markets, the rights of private property and free association, so too it must defend the other foundational truths articulated in the Declaration. Bret saw that we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. The self-evident right to life is something enjoyed not only by the strong and the powerful, the rich and the famous, but by all human beings, including the weak, the marginalized, and the infirm, both born and unborn, wanted or unwanted. Redefining who is included in the community of rights-bearing individuals is not the principal thing for conservatives to do. The first right protected in the Bill of Rights was the free exercise of religion. Citizens, the groups that they form, and the businesses they run should be free to act in the public square according to their conscientious beliefs. And defending this right is the principled thing for conservatives to do. The laws of nature and nature's God provide the definition of the marriage-based family, the fundamental institution of civil society, which provides children with a relationship with the man and the woman, the mother and the father who helped create them. Redefining marriage is neither principled nor conservative. It does nothing to advance the cause of social justice. It does nothing to protect the rights of children. It does nothing to advance liberty. For all people of the same sex in all 50 states are free to live and to love how they want to. They're free to have a marriage celebrated in a house of worship if the house of worship wants to. They're free to have marriage benefits if their business wants to provide them with it. Redefining marriage would coerce all citizens, all religious institutions and all businesses into treating a same-sex relationship as if it's a marriage, even when those businesses, those citizens, and those religious institutions think otherwise. The coercion here, the liberty here, the pursuit of happiness here runs in the exact opposite direction. Government's not in the marriage business because it cares about the love lives of consenting adults. If marriage is just about adult romance, get the state out of the bedroom. Government's in the marriage business because children need a mom and a dad, and the sexual union of a man and a woman can produce a child, and if that man and that woman don't commit to each other permanently and exclusively and take responsibility for those children that they create, the children suffer and the welfare state increases, and crime rises, and government grows. So the point of this is that at the end of the day, both economic conservatism and social conservatism spring forth from the same source. They're grounded in the same principles of natural right and natural law that informed our founding. Principles that the conservative movement exists to conserve. And as the experience of the past 40 years have shown, limited government, fiscal conservatism, is impossible without the strong civil society that social conservatism exists to protect. Likewise, social conservatism is impossible when the welfare state destroys the family and then it further weakens civil society. So in truth, social conservatism and fiscal conservatism are indivisible. They're one and the same thing. So that was point one about principles. Second, practicalities. If there is a culture war in America, conservatives are not the aggressors. Conservatives cannot call a truce while liberals push for taxpayer-funded abortions throughout all 9 months of pregnancy, while liberals force employers and individuals to pay for coverage of abortion-inducing drugs, while liberals push to redefine marriage, to shut down Christian adoption agencies, and to force evangelical photographers, florists, bakers, and innkeepers to celebrate same-sex relationships. A unilateral truce is impossible. That would just be surrender. But if liberals are willing to agree to a truce, if they're willing to stop advancing their radical abortion agenda, to stop violating our first freedom to religious liberty, if they're willing to stop redefining marriage and then coercing those who disagree, then yes, a truce would be a wonderful idea, and sign me up. I don't see the liberals agreeing to that truce. Lastly, there's the politics point. As we heard in the previous panel, I think it's fair to say that it's a mistake to view the results of the 2012 election as primarily a fault of Mitt Romney being too socially conservative. Mitt Romney did not lose that election because of his stance on abortion or gay marriage or religious liberty. In fact, he only talked about religious liberty once or twice during the entire campaign. He ran exactly one ad on abortion, and it was to tell voters that he wasn't as pro-life as Obama was claiming. One television ad in the entire election. A careful look at the polling data actually suggests that it was the conservative economic message and the conservative economic messengers that left voters with cold feet and that failed to connect with average citizens. The virtues of entrepreneurship and wealth creation resonate with certain types of people in Manhattan and in Georgetown, not for hourly wage workers, not for those who are unemployed. Our conservative economic message did not resonate with average Americans. But we do know several things that does result from conservatives hitting the mute button on the social issues. One is that evangelicals don't show up to vote, so you turn off your base. They don't get worked up. They don't go campaigning for the candidate. So you have a low voter turnout of your own base. They don't trust you when the only ad you run on abortion is to say you're not really all that pro-life, when you don't discuss Obamacare in terms of its religious liberty infringements, but only in terms of its economic costs. Second, if conservatives fail to frame the social issues for themselves, liberals will frame the issues for us. Conservatives can frame positions on social issues in reasonable terms, since the policies that are proposed by conservatives poll much better than those proposed by liberals. But when we fail to frame the social issues for ourselves, when we fail to highlight the extreme natures of liberals who run to support taxpayer-funded abortion on demand throughout all 9 months of pregnancy, then the liberals get to frame us as the extremists. And then we're not controlling our own message, and then we're left with Todd Akin as our spokesperson. So if you don't run on your own issues, Akin will be forced to defend his views on rape. And then you get comments like legitimate rape, because they've framed the issue. Third, in the 2012 election, the social issues outperformed Mitt Romney and the Republican Party in each and every state where a social issue was on the ballot. In Massachusetts, physician-assisted suicide was banned. Mitt Romney did not win his home state of Massachusetts. In 4 states, the definition of marriage was on the ballot. In all 4 states, the traditional definition of marriage outperformed Mitt Romney by huge margins. In Maryland, just to give one example, Mitt Romney got 36% of the vote. Traditional marriage got 48% of the vote. It's hard to say that Mitt Romney lost this election because of social issues. There were 12% of the citizens of Maryland who went to the polls and voted for marriage but didn't vote for Mitt Romney. Why? On life issues, we are consistently seeing that women, youths, independents, and Latinos support the pro-life view at rates greatly outpacing their support for the Republican Party. For example, according to the Gallup poll in May 2013, only 40% of women say abortion should be legal in all or most cases, while 57% of women say abortion should be illegal in all or most cases. The same poll found millennials, that's my generation, to be the most pro-life generation of all. The younger people going soft on social issues is an illusion. It's true that they're weakening on marriage, but that's only to be expected. When the Wall Street Journal doesn't run any editorials defending our views about marriage.
It's so true.
You ran my editorial marriage, but
Well, right. I mean,
but it was paired. Let me rephrase. When they don't run any staff editorials, right? So mine was an op-ed, to be technical. Mine was a guest op-ed, and it was paired with Ken Melman's. So the way the Wall Street Journal frames this is that this is an open debate for conservatives to be having. We're airing both sides, and it was on the same page, right? Same day of the newspaper. Would they ever do that when it comes to free trade or low taxes? Would they show, let's have a debate among conservatives and Republicans, let's have those for higher taxes and those for lower taxes on the same page? In their editorial voice, they have not editorialized in recent history in defense of marriage. So it's not surprising, and that's just an illustrative example. It's not surprising when the conservative leaders refuse to speak out in defense of marriage that young people are afraid to speak out on it. But I've been spending the past year going to college campuses. Last night I was at Princeton. We had a little over 300 people in the lecture hall. It was roughly split 50-50. But young people, when they actually hear the argument for marriage, they respond. In the same way that 40 years ago, all of the elites in Manhattan and in Georgetown said the pro-lifers were on the wrong side of history, and that the young people were all going to be pro-choice, and that the only pro-lifers that would be left would be the Pope in Rome and some geriatrics in their nursing homes. 40 years later, we see the fruit of their efforts, of the arguments they made, the books they published, the articles that they wrote, the organizations that they formed. The only sitting president to ever write a book while in office, Ronald Reagan, Abortion and the Conscience of a Nation. They used the bully pulpit. They taught. What happens 40 years later? My generation more pro-life than my parents. There's no reason to think that anyone is a lost cause, that there are any permanent victories or defeats in politics. The last thing I'll say here is that only 14% of voters think abortion should be legal in the 3rd trimester. And yet most every liberal politician supports abortion in the 3rd trimester. And yet we never force them to answer that question of why. Because we're afraid of talking about these issues, because we've been told that they're losers. And yet 24-hour waiting periods, parental consent requirements, informed consent laws, they garner about 60 to 70% support with the American public, which is why the governors who are signing these laws into law, week by week, we've had more pro-life legislation passed in the states in the past several years than we've had in the previous 40 years combined. It's the reason why these socially conservative governors have such high opinion poll numbers. They're doing quite well. Last thing I'll say is that the conservative economic stances are right, but our economic messaging is failing to connect with swing voters. The 2013 Economics Values Survey grouped Americans into 3 different types of value system. They looked at economic values, they looked at theological values, and they looked at social values. And so you would have theological liberals, theological moderates, theological conservatives, social liberals, moderates, conservatives. They found that with the American public as a whole, 38% self-identify as theological conservatives, 29% as social conservatives, only 25% as economic conservatives. And that within the Democratic Party, 31% are theological conservatives, 19% are social conservatives, 3% identify as fiscal conservatives. So the study concluded, and I'll quote, Republicans have a better opportunity to attract Democratic defectors with a theologically conservative or a socially conservative message than an economically conservative message, end quote. So I don't want to suggest that the conservative movement give up on fiscal conservatism. Quite the contrary, I think we need to find better ways of explaining why our economic policies will better serve the poor and the middle class. So too, the conservative movement should continue to stand on principle with respect to social issues, being prudent, measured, and persistent in actually explaining why social conservative policies are true and good and beautiful. Only if we remain silent does the left get to effectively characterize our positions as extreme. But in presenting an indivisible conservative vision, we can stand for principle while forming new coalitions and attracting new voters. If you look at the polling numbers for Romney, he was destroyed on the question, does he care about people like me? It was a failure on our communication of the fiscal message. Conservatives want their fellow citizens to pursue happiness and to flourish, which is why conservatives are for life, for religious liberty, for marriage, for economic freedom, for low taxes, for markets and healthcare, for school choice, just to name a few. These social and fiscal positions spring forth from the same source, and we needn't call a truce on either. Thank you.
So my first question is the 3D sonogram has very much changed the direction of the debate in America on abortion. To see a child in a womb laughing at 20 weeks or 22 weeks is a dramatic thing, and it is changing attitudes among the millennials in particular. What is, if anything, the 3D sonogram argument against gay marriage as that very quickly trends towards allowance?
Sure, I assume that's for me, but unless you want to.
I don't even want to think about it.
I won't go there. I'll say a couple of things. In the journal that I edit for the Witherspoon Institute, we've published a couple of articles recently by unlikely spokespeople, people who were unable to publish these articles in mainstream conservative publications nor in LGBT venues. They were both written by people who identify with the LGBT community. One was bisexual, the other is a gay man. The first was titled Growing Up with Two Mothers, The Untold Child Story. It's by Bobby Lopez. He's a professor in California of literature. He grew up with two lesbian mothers. He himself is a bisexual. He does not support the redefinition of marriage, and he was trying to explain why. And he couldn't get a mainstream conservative publication to publish this, nor could he get any voice from the LGBT community to publish it. We published another article by Doug Mainwaring titled I'm Gay and I'm Against Gay Marriage. And he was explaining that he was raising children with his gay partner, and he realized that his kids needed a mom, and that the two best gay fathers in the world couldn't provide a child with a mother, and that he had nothing against gay people. He himself is a gay person. I think the left has been very effective in framing this issue as if the LGBT community speaks in one voice, in the way that they want to say that Barbara Boxer and Nancy Pelosi speak for all women when it comes to women issues. They've been able to say that Andrew Sullivan speaks for all members of the LGBT community when it comes to the marriage question. So I think one thing it's going to be giving voice to people within that community. Even today, during the break, someone came up to me and said, I'm with you on the marriage issue. I was raised by a lesbian. So even, I'm not obviously don't want to say who this person is, but for privacy's sake, but these people exist, and they don't feel comfortable necessarily saying these things in public, and they're only now finding their voice. Second thing is we're starting to get rigorous social science that does look at same-sex parenting, and the results are not very pretty. The results are completely consistent with what we know about alternative family structures from the past 40 years of social science on marriage and parenting. We know that divorce and remarriage, cohabitation, single parenting, even adoption at childbirth, all of the alternatives to the intact biological married mother-father family produce lesser outcomes for the children of such unions. When you hold things constant like education level, income, social status, things like that. And we now have had 3 studies that have used large representative random samples and looked at same-sex parenting, and the results are consistent with these. Because we know three things about parenting: that gender matters, that biology matters, and that stability matters. And that with the same-sex parenting environment, you aren't going to get gender complementary parenting. There's no mothering and fathering. Two moms or two dads doesn't provide that. There's not a biological connection with both parents and the child, and there's not much stability. Lesbian relationships actually tend to be the most unstable of all. People tend to think that lesbians would have the longest lasting relationships. They actually have the shortest lasting, not have anything to do with homosexuality, largely having to do with the fact of the gender distribution of the relationship. Women initiate about 2/3 of all divorces in marriage, and so having the double female relationship is what leads to the instability. You've probably never heard a guy say, yeah, I broke up with her, my emotional needs weren't being met. So when you have the double female relationship, the emotional needs aren't always being met, and they're more likely to split apart. And that's just the nature of the relationship. Not because of the homosexuality aspect, just the double female aspect. So I think we have reason to see that it's not going to be a particularly good thing for child rearing, in the same way that at the time 40 years ago with no-fault divorce, the argument was that, oh, this will be great. And I think now most objective social scientists will say that no-fault divorce has not been good either for women or for children. That divorce reform was needed, but the divorce reform that we got wasn't good. So I think some of the social science might be the sonogram, and then I think some of the spokespeople being unlikely spokespeople. Having a straight white guy speaking on marriage isn't all that effective. Bobby Lopez does a much better job.
Just a correction, later on this evening, you're going to hear from a magnificent writer, now the editor of the New York Post's editorial page, but for many years a columnist with the Wall Street Journal named Bill McGurn, who certainly was not shy about making his views known when it came to, quote, social issues, and spoke with great passion and eloquence about them. So the suggestion that the Wall Street Journal has been in our Olympian Manhattanite mode, disdainful of those unwashed masses at the Heritage Institute is just partially exaggerated.
But only partially.
No, I'm actually totally joking. You asked about the 3D sonogram. To me, the 3D sonogram is Ted Haggard. You know, how many instances of this? You know, there are two kinds of gay marriage, okay? There's the gay marriage that Ryan is very opposed to, and then there's the gay marriage which all of you in your lives know. He comes home at 4 in the morning because he's working so hard, and his best friend is this guy he knew in college, and they go and take long weekends together fishing, okay? That's also gay marriage, okay? That's what happens when gay people, men or women, are thrust into relationships, heterosexual relationships, that they don't want to be in, okay? But they do so because they're searching for social respectability. And one of the things about gay marriage, which I think is important for all of us to recognize, is that it is a way of bringing love and passion and social respectability together, which and ought to be a fundamental conservative, at least American conservative goal. So please, think about, when you think about opposition to gay marriage, ask how you feel about all those other people who, for reasons we're all familiar with, have been thrust into these horror show marriages, which are horrible for the gay partner and actually even worse for the non-gay partner who's being betrayed in multiple ways. Let's just think about the kind of universe of moral issues that are at play beyond the issue of rearing children. You talked about the importance of marriage as an institution for rearing children, and again, in my Olympian Manhattanite way, I'm actually raising 3 children in Manhattan with my lawfully wedded wife. But, you know, could go either way, you know what I mean? But, you know, I'm reminded of this wonderful joke. Okay, people think marriage, you keep saying, or you've written, I can't remember if you said this about marriage and the importance of marriage and procreation. Procreation is a big part of marriage. There's no question about it. Marriage is instituted for all kinds of things. You know, there's the story of the elderly widower and the widow, and they meet in some, you know, social club in Boca or Palm Beach, and, you know, he's telling her about his investments, and they're dancing, and he's so charming, and she, you know, as the evening wears on, she says, and what about sex? And he says, oh, infrequently. And she says, is that one word or two? So that is not a marriage for procreation, or will not be a marriage for procreation, and yet we sanction it because we understand that the purposes of marriage go beyond simply the act of procreating and raising children. There are scores of purposes of marriage, not the least of which is the comfort of old age, which is something that I don't see in your writing, and I don't see really much discussed when people talk about the importance of marriage as an institution. I don't want to denigrate for 1 second how important marriages and a stable two-parent household is for raising good and moral and productive children. Also raising neurotics and all the rest of it, but generally speaking, I accept the social sciences. But at the same time, conservatives also believe in things called experiments in liberty. The phrase comes from the real liberal John Stuart Mill, who all of you read and admire. And in a sense, I concede that gay marriage is one of these grand experiments in liberty. And you know something? There's a lot of responsibility hanging, I think, on gay men and women who are entering these marriages to demonstrate that this is an institution that isn't going to prove to be deeply destructive in the long term. It would be arrogant of me to say that 50 years from now, we're all going to be looking back on this as one happy moment in the way that we now look back on, say, the March on Washington. But I think it would be equally foolish to say this has no place, this is going to be terribly destructive, and so on, because people made similar predictions 50 years ago about other great civil rights movements, which today all of us broadly applaud for all of the difficulties that they brought with them. So I just want to be clear that we shouldn't be so rigid in our views about an institution which has many purposes and so convinced that it is destined to lead to something awful. America is, as I said, a land of experiments in liberty. Lots of them fail, but lots of them succeed, and we should be optimistic about the potential for their success.
Well, I'd just like to put in a denigrating word about John Stuart Mill. I think the phrase Bret was thinking of, it comes from his little polemical pamphlet on liberty. It's Experiments in Living. And this is not the venue in which to enter into a disquisition about it, but I think it can be convincingly argued. Certainly, Mill's great critic James Fitzjames Stephen argued that what Mill proposed there, and there are many different Mills. Gertrude Himmelfarb wrote an essay called "The Other Mill," which is about the good John Stuart Mill. But in the On Liberty pamphlet, I think what you have is a profoundly anti-conservative, and ultimately, despite its title, anti-libertarian pamphlet. In my view, what Mill was really about was bringing a new orthodoxy to the table, the orthodoxy of his brand of utilitarian rationalism, to which he hoped that all right-thinking, that is to say, left-leaning people would submit. And he sort of redefined rationalism to mean a certain species of utilitarian calculus, and he said that he valued nonconformity. He regarded things like custom and convention and habit, all those words that I mentioned in my brief remarks, as the enemy of this new dispensation that he was bringing. He sought to bring an alternative to the traditional British Christianity and the moral vision that underwrote it. And the curious thing is that although he is sometimes embraced by libertarians, the vision that Mill espoused also shares quite a bit with the vision, for example, of his contemporary Mr. Bentham. I mean, what he was really bringing was a new orthodoxy, that it was fine to be nonconformist and so on, as long as you did it according to the strictures set out, by John Stuart Mill. But again, this is maybe we're kind of moving a little to one side of the panel. I would just like to say that I don't think there's as much. I don't think there's as much distance between Ryan and Bret as there may seem to be here, because I think that if we step back and say, what is the fundamental issue that we're talking about here? If I understood Ryan right, it's to rethink what the legitimate role of the government should be. The government can do certain things very well. The United States Army, for example, that's terrific. They know how to do that. I'm not so sure they're so great at a lot of other things. Healthcare, should the government be involved in healthcare? Should they be involved? I would say they shouldn't be involved in, like, your old age pension. Why is the government doing that? In my view, they should certainly not be involved in defining what marriage is. I would want to get them out of that business altogether. Now, if you believe, as Ryan does, that marriage is a certain sort of thing, then you need to have people around, priests, philosophers, politicians, teachers, parents, who can argue that this is what marriage means. It should not be, in my view, the business of politicians. And what we have come to the point that Hayek warned about in The Road to Serfdom, when he said that a regular result of extensive government control is a psychological alteration in the character of the people. And that alteration is this, that it habituates them to dependency. And, we in so many ways now are more dependent upon our largely unaccountable masters in Washington, who are telling us what we should want and how we should want it. And I think that it represents a gigantic threat not only to individual liberty, but also to the future greatness of this country. And I think that that is the future of conservatism, is to try to attack that metastasizing statist imperative that has reached its tentacles into so many different avenues of our lives.
We've been running a little bit over, so if there's, we're going to take one more question. Does somebody have one? Sir, you're the winner. Thanks.
If we admit that same-sex marriage, for example, is something that should be legitimized, approved, and even acclaimed, aren't we inviting a slippery slope? What about polygamy and various other arrangements between consenting adults? Doesn't this open the door to something that we really ought to think about in terms of social policy? What argument could you make against polygamy, for example, if you admit self-sex marriage? And where does it go from there? And this is not purely theoretical, because believe me, they are waiting in the wings for the right moment to push their agenda. So I'd like to...
I'll respond if you want.
No, I'm happy to answer that. The answer is, how shall I put this with reference to my story about Mikas? The word ba does not stand for consent in any language. I mean, it's one of these arguments you hear. The next thing you know, it'll be sheep or goats or, the man who marries the horse. The more serious argument is about polygamy, which is a legitimate argument in the sense that you have a religion of more than 1 billion people in which polygamy is normal. It's inherently unequal. And when people talk about equal rights, that's part of the problem with polygamy. Polygamy is inherently unequal. 1 man, 12 wives. I mean, that's also inherently insane. So that's a second, a more principled point. The third point, though, is, look, societies draw the line. And the fact that you decide to retreat from one line to another does not mean that it's the Maginot Line and after that Paris falls in 6 weeks. Okay? You draw the line. And we are redrawing lines all the time in all ways in life, including semantic ways. That's part of the nature of America, it's experimentation in living, Stuart Mill or not. We would draw another line. And I think most Americans feel very strongly that there are profound arguments to be made against polygamy that go back also with the LDS Church, so that there is a basis in constitutional jurisprudence. But the more basic point is, you don't say, because we don't necessarily want people to have the right to own, say, artillery in their back lawn, that we are going to forbid rifles or even semi-automatics or whatever. We draw lines all the time. So that's just another line we would draw. I've never found it a particularly dispositive argument.
So I take obviously a different perspective on that question. I don't see why it would be unequal and insane at all. And I didn't hear an argument from Bret as to why it would be. If consenting adults want to structure their lives this way, who are you to say that that relationship is unequal? Who are you to interfere with their experiment in living and interfere with their liberty right to live how they want to if they're consenting adults? What principle would limit it? And that's what I think is most important with seeing that on offer in this discussion about marriage are two different visions of what marriage is. The vision that Bret presented is largely one about adult romance, mutual caregiving, loving support, that sort of thing. He explicitly mentioned, caregiving and not being lonely later in life, that we hadn't spoken enough about the elderly and companionship late in life. From our perspective, this just conflates marriage with companionship. It just conflates a natural institution of marriage into a much broader human institution, a broader human phenomenon of friendship, companionship, loving and caring relationships. So there's no reason, that's okay. There's no reason in principle that this vision of marriage should be inherently limited to two people. The way in which Western law and society arrived at monogamy was that it was one man and one woman who can unite in the type of act that can create new life. Every new life deserves exactly one mother and one father. That was where we got to the uniqueness of the value two. Once you say it's irrational and arbitrary to define marriage as a male-female relationship, there is no principle that would limit it to a couple rather than a throuple. And so even to take away the question, a throuple, by the way, is a three-person couple. This was something that New York Magazine introduced to me. And it's good because it actually eliminates the unequal and insane aspect about Bret's argument from polygamy, because a throuple can be three people of the same sex. And unlike polygamy, polyamory is group marriage. So polygamy would be one man with this woman, one man with that woman, one man with that woman, one man with a fourth woman, and up to 12, as Bret's example used. In polyamory, it's a group marriage. So Newsweek magazine in 2009 reported that there are 500,000 polyamorous households in the United States. So the question is, when they sue for their marriage equality, when they're up before the Supreme Court and they say, your marriage laws fail to treat my marriage equally, we're a same-sex throuple. What principle? Because ideas have consequences. We have to think through. It's not Bret accuses me of being a rigid thinker. No, I just want to be a logical thinker. I just want to see what happens when you remove the male-female aspect of marriage. What principle would there be for it to be a two-person union? But then likewise, why would it be a sexually exclusive union? One thing that we know about gay-male relationships, they tend to be more sexually open than lesbian relationships and more sexually open than heterosexual relationships. Dan Savage, in a profile of him in the New York Times Magazine, introduced me to the term monogamish. So he wants to retain monogamy, a two-person relationship, but he thinks that heterosexuals can learn something from the gay-male community about the virtues of open relationships. So Savage thinks that actually one of the problems is that we have an unrealistic view of marriage in that we should only have sex with our spouse, and that the emotional relationship between spouses, the romantic caregiving aspect of marriage, could actually be enhanced by consensual extramarital outlets. So he doesn't want deceit, he doesn't want coercion, but he thinks there's no reason in principle for it to be sexually exclusive. The last thing I'll mention about this is the term wed lease. A wed lease is a play on the word wedlock. Wedlock describes something permanent, stable, you lock yourself in for life. A wed lease was something the Washington Post introduced me to 3 months ago, right after the Supreme Court ruled on same-sex marriage. They were waiting to publish this till afterwards. The argument the man was advancing was that the problem with marriage laws we currently have is we have this unrealistic expectation of permanency. It's unrealistic to think you're going to love and live with the same person for the rest of your life. Better to have a wed lease. So just like you can lease a car or lease a house, why not lease a spouse? And you could have a 5 or a 10-year marriage license that would be renewable on good behavior. So if the marriage isn't going well, no harm,
This is a
no
bad
foul.
idea?
Right. And so, that's a perfect interjection. Because if your conception of marriage is mainly about adult desire, mainly about adult romance, rather than about the needs of children, if your conception of marriage is more about the type of thing that's going to satisfy adult well-being rather than the needs of the children, especially when we have about 40% of children right now are born outside of a marital family. So about 40% of all Americans are growing up without a father. It's about 50% in the Latino community and 70-something% in the black community. And the consequence is this for those children as far as perpetuating cycles of poverty. No one's written better about this than Kay Heimowitz at the Manhattan Institution and Charles Murray at AEI. The impact for those kids and then the impact for all of us as taxpayers, because the liberals will now propose another government welfare program to pick up the pieces. What would be the consequences if we redefine marriage along Bret's lines, which are mainly about adult romance, where it doesn't matter the number of participants, whether it's a throuple, a couple, a quartet, consenting adults, whether it's temporary or permanent, a wed lease or a wedlock, whether it's monogamish or monogamous, sexually open or sexually closed. Your experiments in living can say good or a bad thing. From a policy perspective, the consequences would be disastrous. Because the reason the government's in the marriage business is to incentivize a man and a woman to commit permanently and exclusively to each other so that men don't create fatherless children and fragmented families. And for every additional sexual partner I have, for the shorter lived my sexual relationships are, the greater the likelihood that I create children with multiple women. My time, my resources, my love, my care, my attention is then divided across these families. And the social outcomes will be disastrous. This isn't rigid thinking, this is just logical thinking. And I think conservatives need to do more of it when it comes to an institution like marriage, which is about promoting this public good, not just about experimenting in liberty and experimenting in lifestyles.
Sorry, very briefly. The Wall Street Journal is not an authoritative news source, but Newsweek is? I just want to make two.
So you think they're lying about the number of
Yes,
polyamorous
I do.
households?
I do think they're lying. I think there was a study picked up by some 19-year-old intern at Newsweek and promoted by John Meacham, desperately trying to save his pathetic magazine. I guess it was Tina Brown. to do this. But, and I also am amazed by where this leaves sterile couples or all kinds of couples who don't have children, who should just be in the companionship zone because somehow, precisely by your logic, they are not in the business of procreation and raising children. Of course, this would spite Pat Buchanan, so that's a good thing. But aside from that, look, conservatives are in the business of encountering the world as it is. Okay, and in the world as it is, okay, there is no question there is tremendous amount of rot in our social institutions. I'm the last person to dispute that. And there are broken children everywhere, and I see this all the time. And 99.9% of them are the result of messed up heterosexual relationships, all right? We've devoted this entire conversation to this dire threat that 1.5 or 2% of the population, which is clamoring to participate in this institution, are somehow a threat to it. And yet, none of this conversation so far, for reasons that I understand, okay, but none of this conversation is focused on, these things that you point out, which are worrying and should worry all conservatives about these kind of dead souls or broken people who are making their way through high schools and Yale University, the products of divorces and single. All of this has nothing to do with gay marriage.
Right, so that's
and
where
so
we
ask
disagree.
yourself, so wait a second, ask yourself, okay, the world went to hell, if you really want to date it, to around 1962 and the invention of the pill. All right? Actually, I don't think the world went to hell. I think it became great, but that's another story. All right? But if you're a serious social conservative, you will acknowledge that what really happened is suddenly female biology and female sexuality were were separated from one another, and everything that followed, okay? That's a conversation worth having about the consequences for society, et cetera, but it's simply bizarre that the conservative world has now wrapped itself around this idea that, the one thing that is threatening Western civilization at this moment in time is that hundreds of thousands of gay people would like to participate in this old-fashioned institution. By the way, I understand the gay case against gay marriage. A gay friend of mine put it to me, what's the point of being gay if you have to get married? That I get. But we're in a sense having the wrong conversation because of this obsession among some group of conservatives with the gay issue. It's
Right, so
bizarre.
the only person obsessing with the gay issue is Bret. I didn't talk about gay marriage, I talked about marriage, and I talked about why marriage matters and why it matters for the conservative movement to enshrine an accurate conception of what marriage is into law. Throughout all of Bret's comments today, it's been about gay rights and about gay liberation and getting people out of closets and things like that. That's Bret's obsession. My obsession is with actually doing something to restore a healthy marriage culture. And it's not clear to me how you restore a healthy marriage culture when you redefine marriage to obscure the sexual purpose and function of marriage. In all of the writings that I've done about marriage, it's always been about why the public law will teach something about marriage, and then what the law teaches about marriage will impact people's behavior. So Bret's exactly right to say that it was 40 years ago that marriage culture went to hell in a handbasket. Then he corrected himself to say, actually, it was a good thing. Yes, as an upper middle-class white male, he might think it's a good thing, the sexual revolution. I don't know if black women in Anacostia would think it's a good thing. I don't know if it would be a good thing for the people who have been the victims of what Kay Heimowitz calls marriage and caste in America. Because the victims of this sexual revolution and the original marriage movement wasn't obsessing with gay issues. The original leaders of the marriage movement, people who organized in the 70s and the 80s and the 90s, were concerned with reforming the no-fault divorce laws, concerned with combating cohabitation, concerned with lowering the out-of-wedlock childbearing rate. It was in 2003, 10 years ago, when an activist court in Massachusetts redefined marriage for that state, that group of scholars and activists said, how will we be able to say that fathers are essential when the law is now saying that fathers are optional? And they said, we can't. Because for us to say that, we will be treated as bigots. And then shortly thereafter, we saw Catholic Charities adoption agencies forced to shut down in Massachusetts because they wanted to place the orphans in their care with mothers and fathers, to give those orphans the best chance at a bright future. And the law said, that's discrimination. So it has nothing to do with about obsessing with whether or not a small handful of gays and lesbians will participate in this institution. It has to do with whether we will redefine what the institution is, why it matters, and whether we even have the freedom in our civil institutions to live out that vision about marriage, or whether the forces of government will shut us down as bigots. That's what the debate is about.
Roger's going to throw one little smidgen in, and then rapturous applause, yeah.
Very briefly, I have to say that whenever I've been confronted with this question of defining marriage and, what is gay marriage and so on, I always think of that chapter in Through the Looking Glass when Alice is conversing with Humpty Dumpty. And Humpty Dumpty says, well, that's glory for you. And Alice says, well, what do you mean by glory? He says, well, glory, I mean by glory, a nice knockdown argument. And Alice says, well, that's not what glory means. And Humpty Dumpty says, well, words mean what I choose them to mean. And I say it means a nice knockdown argument. And Alice says, well, you can't just make up meanings. And he says, no, it all depends on who has the power, who's master.
Perfect.
Mix it up
I
like
think we did our job.